In the summer of 1941, the survival of the Allied powers rested on a handful of critical military errors made by the Axis High Command. If the German generals had executed their original invasion plans without these tactical missteps, the geopolitical map of the 20th century would have collapsed into a totalitarian empire. The first pivot point was Operation Barbarossa. In our timeline, German commanders bypassed a massive concentration of Soviet troops in the southwestern front to race for Kiev. Had those armored columns instead encircled and destroyed that vulnerable Soviet salient from the outset, the Red Army's defensive line could have entirely shattered, leaving the Soviet Union exposed to total occupation. With the Eastern Front secured, the German military could have turned its full industrial weight toward the United Kingdom. The plan to invade Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, was heavily documented. Intelligence officers had already catalogued European river barges, specifically noting their 400-ton capacities. These documents outline exactly how the German Navy intended to modify these commercial vessels into landing craft. Their objective was to transport enough troops and armor across the English Channel to overwhelm whatever resistance the Royal Air Force could still mount. Surviving both the Soviet and British campaigns would leave the Axis with total control over Europe. Without a foothold in the West or a bleeding wound in the East, the Third Reich would have the geographic and economic leverage to permanently dismantle the international order. With the European powers defeated, the globe would be neatly partitioned. Germany would absorb the vast agricultural and mineral wealth of the former Soviet Union, while the Empire of Japan would assume unchallenged military dominance over the Pacific Ocean and Southeast Asia. In December 1941, Japanese diplomats actually presented the Germans with a drafted military convention to finalize this arrangement. They proposed drawing a hard border straight down the 70th meridian east, slicing through the Ob River. German economic planners rejected that line because it cut through organic economic zones. They countered with a border along the Yenisei River. This revised line assigned Afghanistan and India to Japan, but secured the Kuznetsk industrial basin and the iron ore deposits of the Ural Mountains for the Reich's war economy. This negotiation dissolved the concept of independent nations. The Asian continent was reduced to two massive mechanized resource zones: the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere in the east, and German Lebensraum, or living space, in the west. Domestic life inside this newly expanded Germany relied on neighborhood surveillance. The party maintained authority down to the street level, using a block lighter, a local official whose express duty was to spy on the residents in their block and report anyone spreading damaging rumors to the state. For the newly conquered territories in the east, the policy was biological engineering. SS leader Heinrich Himmler was put in charge of executing General Plan Ost, the master plan for the colonization of Eastern Europe. The plan detailed the forced deportation, enslavement, and mass starvation of tens of millions of Slavic people and Eastern European Jews. Populations categorized by Nazi ideology as subhuman were to be systematically worked to death or exterminated to clear the land. The murdered populations would be replaced by a living wall of German soldier peasants. Meanwhile, Hermann Göring utilized his plenary powers under the 4-year plan to plunder the region's remaining raw materials, stripping the occupied states of scrap metal, machinery, and agricultural yields to insulate the German economy. The ultimate objective of the Reich was the demographic and economic replacement of the human populations residing in Eastern Europe, converting millions of square miles into an exclusive agrarian engine for the German military. Across the Atlantic, the United States and the remaining independent nations of the Americas would find themselves locked in an industrialized dystopian standoff against a fully resourced Axis alliance. This global friction would trigger a hyper-accelerated arms race. The Axis held a distinct early advantage in aeronautics and rocketry, fielding the world's first operational jet-powered fighter plane, the Messerschmitt Me-262. Yet the production of these advanced weapons relied heavily on chattel slavery. The Reich operated on the backs of an estimated 12 million forced laborers abducted from Eastern Europe, building infrastructure in underground stone quarries and assembling munitions under constant threat of execution. To weaken the Western Hemisphere without direct confrontation, Germany deployed the Auslandsorganisation, or AO. This foreign intelligence unit infiltrated South American republics, establishing undercover economic operations to secure vital raw materials and funneling propaganda to local ethnic German communities to spark proxy conflicts. Even with the European continent conquered, The Axis economies were built strictly for resource extraction and rearmament. The result would be a perpetual, global mobilization for a war that could never truly end. The sheer geography of this victory guaranteed its eventual failure. A border stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Yenisei River required millions of troops just to garrison, stretching supply lines to the breaking point, while violent resistance networks sabotaged the railways from underground. But the fatal vulnerability was structural. The Nazi administration relied on intentional bureaucratic chaos. The SS, the traditional military, and regional party leaders constantly fought each other for jurisdiction and resources. There were no clear lines of legal accountability. Every dispute could only be resolved by direct orders from Adolf Hitler. When the dictator inevitably dies, that single unifying node vanishes. Without a central authority to mediate the overlapping jurisdictions, the heavily armed factions within the state would immediately turn their weapons on each other in a violent succession crisis. Fascism functions by organizing society against a designated enemy. Once the external wars are won, the system's inherent paranoia and structural instability force it to cannibalize itself from the inside out. None of the plans for this timeline require speculation. They were not fiction. Operation Sea Lion's logistical timetables, the Yenisei River partition agreements, and the demographic extermination quotas of General Plan Ost were fully drafted, typed, and authorized by the ruling governments of Germany and Japan. We know the exact tonnage of the invasion barges and the internal administrative rivalries of the SS because Allied investigators captured these archives. They were meticulously translated and presented as evidence to the world during the Nuremberg military tribunals. The Allied victory in 1945 physically dismantled the infrastructure required to execute these documents. It prevented the implementation of a globally engineered nightmare, leaving these archives as a permanent record of what the Axis intended to build.